Well, do another edition of AP US History at University High School, and we're continuing with the Nixon Foreign Policy notes. We finished up with China and rapprochement, but the one word catchphrase that you need to remember for Nixon's foreign policy is détente. Détente. The issue of war and peace cannot be solved unless we, in the United States and the Soviet Union, demonstrate both the will and the capacity to put it should say our relationship on a basis consistent with the aspirations of mankind. Richard Nixon talking to the UN General Assembly in 1970. In other words, cooperation. So détente is the policy, and what it means, I think, literally is like easing of tensions. So after years of hostility and tension between the USSR and the US, Nixon instituted a policy of détente. Détente focuses on peaceful negotiations and weapons limitation. That's what it focused on between these two nations. So it was like a simmering down, if you will, of the tensions. Unlike previous administrations, Nixon and Kissinger, they hoped to negotiate for mutual benefit between the USSR and the US, as opposed to demanding that the USSR give in to all US demands, which but however, this didn't mean that they weren't, opposing possible communist regimes in other parts of the world. They certainly intervened in Latin America, in certain places where socialist governments were even like democratically elected. So we'll talk about that near the end of the notes here. So let's talk about arms limitation. SALT I was signed during the Nixon administration, and SALT is the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty is one of the major components of détente. So it was at a meeting in Moscow. The anti-ballistic missile treaty had permanent restrictions on ABMs, but allowed for a country to pull out within the first 6 months if they deemed it too detrimental to their national security. The treaty was not as important for its missile limitations as it was for opening up successful negotiations between these two world powers. So here's Nixon after he visited China. He also went to Moscow, or maybe a little before, in 1973. Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, who replaced Nikita Khrushchev, visited the White House. He was Soviet premier until he died, I think, in 1983 or 84. This was the first ever meeting of these countries' leaders not outside of the USSR or US border, showing the steps that détente had taken to ease these tensions, and Gerald Ford continued this policy by visiting Brezhnev in 1975. We don't need this part, triangular diplomacy, so let's move on. Did he succeed with the USSR? Nixon successfully was able to limit production of missiles through a treaty for the first time in U.S. history. That's SALT I. That began to reduce the stockpile of nuclear weapons between these two nations. He was able to open up foreign relations with a country that had been a tremendous enemy since 1945, and that's the Soviet Union. Well, excuse me, we're talking about the Soviet Union here. And this set a precedent for his successor, that's Gerald Ford, who maintained friendly relations with the USSR. So tensions began to ease, détente, that's for sure. And it even led to, in 1975, the Helsinki Accords. Helsinki's capital of Finland, of course. Accords are agreements. It's not a mid-sized sedan here in this context. So this is President Gerald Ford. His presidency, the Soviets guaranteed more liberal exchanges of people and information between the East and the West, and what was written in there, the protection of certain basic human rights were part of the Helsinki Accords. Those were and were not followed at various times in the rest of the history of the Soviet Union, but it's still a big major. Ford with George Harrison, a member of the Beatles, right? And I'm not sure who the shaggy-haired fellow is. The Soviets ended up reneging on some of those pledges, but Ford maintained détente, but relations later on started to deteriorate, especially when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. We're going to do one more foreign policy hotspot. So we've got the Soviets, and actually two, excuse me, and then we're going to come back to domestic policy here. So let me scooch forward in the PowerPoint and go to Chile. ¿Dónde estás, Chile? Oops. There we go. I don't see why we need to stand idly by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people, meaning the voters. Henry Kissinger, U.S. Secretary of State, and he was a big advocate of intervening in Chile during the event that happened there in the early 70s. So the Western goals there were to balance Western interest against other domestic and foreign policy concerns. So they pushed for. Hang on a second here. Let's just scooch forward. Basically, the United States wanted to maintain, they wanted to see the industrialization and growth of Latin America in the hemisphere, but they wanted to see a unity as well, a kind of common solidarity in this hemisphere against the further expansion of socialism in the hemisphere. And the issue revolved around these two men here. This was the president-elect of Chile on, well, on your left is not, but on the left there. And that's Salvador Allende. He was elected president, Salvador Allende. Now, this man here is a military general named Augusto Pinochet. Augusto Pinochet. Man, we don't have to go through all of this, but Salvador Allende won the election in a majority won the majority in a three-way election. So it was pretty split. He ended up only getting like 30-something% of the vote, 40-something% of the vote. He's a supporter of the far left and America's major enemy as well, Cuba. So Nixon was very furious the fact that Allende could become president. He called a meeting, and that is when they began to plan. The CIA devised a plan to have the Congress in Chile actually choose this right-wing candidate, Jorge Alessandri. Alessandri would then resign a few days after winning, allowing for a new two-way election, which the U.S. hoped Allende would lose. And then these new elections would allow the third candidate, the popular Eduardo Frei, to defeat Allende, quote-unquote, fairly. This is all very elaborate, and the CIA planned to do this through basically fomenting a kind of just discontent there. Frei, however, didn't agree to his role. The CIA then developed a plan called Track 2. This planned to have a general overthrow the Chilean government and dissolve the Congress. So it's a military coup. This is a CIA plan to this. Frei would be forced into temporary exile, allowing for another set of elections where Frei would be chosen. So he was the candidate that the United States wanted. The first attempt at a coup under this general was a failure. Kissinger called it off. Salvador Allende took office later in 1970. And he was inaugurated. A lot of people supported him. He's a pretty popular candidate. He attempted to ease these tensions between the parties and expressed a desire to form more unity in Chile. You can just get the big picture here. You don't have to be copying this stuff down word for word. So how does the CIA become involved? They spent $2 million training anti-communist guerrillas in rural regions of Chile. They organized covert actions to remove Allende from office. A lot of them were not successful. And they created something called the 40 Committee. Wait, what was the 40 Committee that oversaw the CIA? I don't remember. Anyway, but what they were going to do is political manipulation in the Chilean government, propaganda, trying to, I don't know, cause some kind of discontent in the country that would appear that the people are not content with Allende, and then the military would have justification for overthrowing him, causing these social disturbances, if you will, in the country. So they contributed thousands of dollars in support of manipulating the Chilean government, but that was not successful. The ordeal in Chile was detrimental also to the viability of the CIA. That is, if it was not going to be successful, the CIA might lose a lot of credibility with the presidency or the Defense Department, for example. So in 1973, this culminated in a coup. Despite Allende's desire, his supporters divided Chile even further, actually. And we don't need all of these details. But in 1973, a coup began against the Allende government led by Augusto Pinochet. He led the attack on the presidential palace. The U.S. reopened economic aid to that coup that had been closed to Allende, and Allende was successfully overthrown. Pinochet rose to power, and he became the president, a kind of dictator of Chile from 1973 until the early 1990s. The American government continued to support Pinochet's conservative militaristic ways. Despite a lot of atrocities that were committed against the Chilean people, because many people who opposed this coup were rounded up into stadiums, soccer stadiums and executed en masse, or they were just disappeared. Later on, Allende was tried by an international criminal court when he was captured, I think, in Paris in 1995, I believe. So let's move on to possibly an even more important issue. Well, it is more important globally, and that is Arab-Israeli relations. This first kind of slide is background. That's really review from world history that you don't need to know. Israel's created in, I mean, you need to know, but you already know, really. Created in 1948 and immediately was invaded by 5 Arab Muslim neighboring countries, so all sorts of tensions ensued. But from the beginning, the U.S. was an Israeli ally, steadfastly, and even through today. A war in 1976 saw, and it was a 6-day war, 1967, excuse me, saw Israel just wipe out the Egyptian Air Force. Or wait, that was the Yom Kippur War. Yeah, that was Yom Kippur. But in this war as well, Israel was very successful, and they expanded their territory into areas that were not originally granted to them by the United Nations, including the Gaza Strip from the Palestinians, the West Bank from the Palestinians, the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. So they assumed that the Arabs would not dare attack them again so soon, but and we're going to move forward here because we need to get to the Yom Kippur War. Another war happened in 1973 where the Arab nations of Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel. In this war, again, and they chose the date the Yom Kippur date. That's the Day of Atonement for Jews. It's the most holy holiday. For obvious reasons, they chose that war, kind of a surprise attack. They correctly assumed that Israel would be most vulnerable on that day, and they were. Israelis could not stop their enemy's advance for the first 2 days. The war lasted, however, a mere 20 days. The fighting was intense, and in this war, Israel was once again very victorious. How did the United States involve itself? Actively supported Israel, both politically and militarily from the beginning of the war. As a result, and they even sent some weapons to Israel, but this is going to cause quite a bit of problems and tensions between the United States and any of its allies, because they've supported Israel. So the conflict also had kind of the feel of a proxy war because Egypt and Syria were kind of under Soviet influence, especially Syria, and Syria is today still under Russian influence. So the fact that the U.S. and other nations were openly supporting Israel in this war led to the Arab nations, OPEC, declaring in 1973 an oil embargo against the United States. This caused a major global economic downturn, felt just all around the world. OPEC placed this embargo against the United States, cut exports to the Netherlands as well for backing Israel. Within a few months, the price of a barrel of oil quadrupled around the world. It was a massive economic crisis all around the world. It's the first time that Arab nations used oil as a political and economic tool. Skip this slide. No, actually we need this slide, very important. No territorial concessions were made, and each side claimed victory for itself. But Egypt began to drift away from the Soviet Union, kind of more towards the United States, because Kissinger began to kind of court, if you will, the new Egyptian president Anwar Sadat. So Israel is still, of course, America's ally. But as a result of this diplomatic shift, Egypt becomes much more willing to negotiate with Israel. And what it culminates in is a very important event in foreign policy called the Camp David Accords. Now that is during the, it shouldn't be 78, is it 78? Yeah. Yeah, okay, it is 78. That's during the Carter administration, the Camp David Accords, because Egypt became the first Arab nation to formally recognize the Jewish state, and that happened at Camp David in the United States. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. Now that was the way for that was paved by the Nixon administration. So we're almost done. We just have to look really quickly at some domestic policy issues for President Nixon. His domestic policy was nicknamed the New Federalism. The New Federalism. And he's a Republican, and so, you know, smaller federal role for the government is more of their emphasis, right? So Congress passed in 1972 a 5-year plan to distribute $30 billion of revenues to the states. So basically states would pay for some of the welfare costs, because welfare is growing as a result of the Great Society as well. So they want states to share the responsibility of this, and that's much more a Republican policy stance in here in the last 3-4 decades. What new congressional legislation happened during Nixon's administration? First of all, Social Security benefits and food stamps actually increased in 1970. That's partially because more people are poorer as well. The economy is slowing down, but also because, I mean, Nixon's kind of a moderate as well, and so he's not as, I don't know, tight-fisted, if you will. And further affirmative action begins to, by establishing goals and timetables for companies to hire women and minorities. So that happens during the Nixon administration as well, which again, is kind of a bit of an anomaly because affirmative action is more associated with the Democratic Party. And this organization is created, very, very important, because this is a period of reform as well. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, created this agency that monitors safety in the workplace. Environmentalism. The EPA was created in 1970 during the Nixon administration. The EPA is probably the biggest thorn in the side of some big companies in America, that I don't know, coal companies, oil companies, things like that. And it's a very, very big and pretty important regulatory agency again today, still today. Its inception climaxed 2 decades of environmentalism, and that was moved forward in a great way by Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. So we'll stop there. The notes were kind of long-ish. Thanks for being troopers, y'all, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.